Mr. Keating, thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us and to relive events that occurred 50 years ago.
Very pleased, very happy to have the opportunity with you, Nikki, to talk about it.
Thank you. Does it feel like it's been 50 years since it all happened? And if you had to choose one word to describe that day, what would it be? Oh,
it was destructive. Destructive. It does feel like 50 years ago, actually. It's a long time ago. Yeah, it was the brutality and malevolence of it all, really, which was so striking, you know. But not immediately apparent on the day because, as you know, the Liberals, after 23 years of government, 18 months into the Whitlam Labor government, the former opposition leader was trying to refuse supply. You know, and of course in 1975, a year later, Malcolm Fraser did.
He did on October 15, it was.
Yeah.
When that happened, what did you think? Did you have any sense of foreboding this might lead to something momentous?
Well, you know, as your audience should know, I met Whitlam and Kerr the last time they saw each other. I was at an executive council meeting of 3 at Government House on the Thursday before the dismissal on the Tuesday.
You'd only just been made a minister.
2 weeks before that. 2 weeks before that. Yeah.
Yes.
And why was I there? Well, I was Minister for Northern Australia and Gough was there to appoint his friend Clem Jones, the former Mayor of Brisbane, as Chairman of the Darwin Reconstruction Commission. So I was, if you like, the relevant minister, and there were 2 other items of business on there. So this a quorum for an executive council meeting is 3, so I was the 3rd person, and that's how it came to be.
And how was it that day? What were the interactions like between Mr. Whitlam and Sir John?
Well, it was pretty amazing, really. I mean, I was held out in the long room outside the Governor-General's office with his private secretary until the time they wanted me to come in. When I come in, there is much guffawing going on, huge boisterous laughter, you know. Of course, I think, well, do I get led into the yarn? Gough said, we're talking about Murphy and Barwick, how they deserve each other. So Kerr starts laughing again, and I said, he said, because it turned out that Murphy wanted Barwick to provide, at the court's expense, a uniform for his female tipstaff, which Barwick wasn't agreeing to. And they're talking about how they deserve each other and how different they are, and they're this and they're that, and there's legal stories getting told and all of this sort of thing, you see.
But so lots of friendly banter between them.
Oh yeah, more than boisterous banter, right? And I thought, well, I am a professional politician, you know. I thought there's something, we're at the penultimate point of the crisis, you know. Either this has been resolved between the 2 of them without me knowing, and they're in the joyful conclusion of it, or why would such mirth be present on such an occasion? So anyway, Kerr says, well, let's get down to the formal business, which is to sign Mr. Jones up as Chairman of the Reconstruction Commission and to do 2 other things, I think, from memory. So we get the documents and sign them, and there's a bit more chatter, and then we leave. As we leave, we go down that long, for people familiar with Government House, a long corridor down to the steps outside. And as I'm walking, Gough says to me, of Kerr, look at that leonine mane. This is Kerr's shock of white hair, you see, which Kerr sort of generously acknowledges, you see. And so we shake hands, we get to the front steps, and Gough gets in the Mercedes and puts his head back, and I said, well, he seems all right, Gough. He said, he's entirely proper, he'll do the right thing. I put that to memory. He's entirely proper, he'll do the right thing.
So there was nothing that happened at that meeting, which was only a few days before November 11,
Yeah,
that showed anything untoward.
nothing. In other words, this is Kerr breaking his commitment, constitutional commitment to his Prime Minister. He was obliged to keep his Prime Minister in the knowledge of his thinking, which he failed, went out of his way to deceive him and failed to do. You see, if you take Queen Elizabeth II, she would never have contemplated this as the monarch, of not accepting the Prime Minister's advice or not being confidential with the Prime Minister about her intentions. The Governor-General of Australia, in the case of John Kerr, he appropriated the kingly powers of the English monarch, distant from London, without the ability of the palace to deal with him, and then used them essentially personally to dismiss the government, without telling Gough Whitlam that Gough's proposal for a half Senate election was, in the Governor-General's opinion, not an adequate remedy. Now, if he'd have said that, the Prime Minister then would have said, OK, well, we'll have either one, a full Senate election, or a general election, but with Whitlam as the Prime Minister. You see what I mean? So, but Kerr did not do this. And so the next time I see Gough is the Tuesday, 4 days later, after he, I, or the rest of us have been dismissed.
How did you hear about what had happened? Who told you? And
I was in the lobby restaurant opposite the old Parliament House with Fred Brenchley, who was the deputy editor of the Financial Review, deputy chief reporter for the Financial Review. I forget who told me, but you know what, Nikki, I was not surprised. I was not at all surprised.
Because?
Oh, because I couldn't believe that at the penultimate point of crisis the previous Thursday, that if you're in such a crisis, even if you do have an Executive Council meeting and you are friendly and all of that, is an occasion for laughter, mirth and going along. In other words, he deceived Whitlam, you see.
He was trying to lull him into a false sense of security, do you think?
Yeah, and succeeded.
And succeeded.
Yeah.
So you were at the lobby restaurant and you heard, I think Laurie Oakes was also in the restaurant at the time.
Well, most of us used to go there, on Tuesdays.
There wasn't anywhere else to go, really. He got a phone call from his office and the waiter told them, and then they all jumped to their feet and ran back to the house. Did you make a quick exit?
Yeah, I went back to the house. I can't remember the exact sequence of events, but Gough had the presence of mind to call the House together, and the House of Representatives voted no confidence in Malcolm Fraser, who had been appointed Prime Minister by Kerr.
And Gordon Scholes was dispatched to Government House to advise the Governor-General of this, but this did not have any effect at all.
Well, the thing was, you see, Scholes was Speaker, and Scholes did take the advising and the decision of the House to Government House. That is true, yeah.
And did you speak to Mr. Whitlam at all beforehand when he was going to meet the Governor-General about the half Senate election?
No, because when I arrived, he was already there.
Right.
He'd come in a different vehicle to me.
And were you surprised that when he returned from Government House that he didn't tell his Senate colleagues about what had happened?
Yes, I was surprised, yes. Because, you see, John Kerr gave Malcolm Fraser the Prime Ministership on the condition that Fraser could guarantee or effect supply in the Senate. But in the end, if the Labor Minister, Ken Reid, had not reintroduced the bill, And because Fraser did not control the House of Representatives, supply couldn't have been guaranteed. So in fact, by Reid proposing to the Senate the bill and the Senate then passing it, meant that they had fulfilled Fraser's obligation. Do you follow me? Yeah.
But if they had not done that, do you think there would have been a resolution, or do you think there would have been maybe a deeper impasse? How would the impasse have been resolved, given that the Prime Minister had already been sacked and another Prime Minister appointed?
Yes. Well, you see, this gets back to the problem of the Senate. The Senate is unrepresentative swill, as I call them, you know. Equal numbers of senators for each state. So Tasmania or South Australia, if you look at the per capita vote of a senator compared to New South Wales, Victoria, completely different. This all occurred, of course, in 1909 in Britain, in the impasse between the House of Commons and the House of Lords, when the Lords, the land-rich Lords, decided to oppose Asquith's government's, Lloyd George's bill to introduce an income tax and a death duty. They voted it down, and Lloyd George and Asquith promised that they would increase the numbers of the Lords so as to have a majority to defeat the old landed Lords. The result of that was 2 elections in Britain in 1910 to resolve it, and then finally in 1911 an agreement by the Lords that they would no longer refuse supply, right? So the British government knows it passes its budget, the Lords do not refuse supply. You cannot, in our structure, do that. In other words, we're in a system where it is a deadlock is a possibility, a permanent possibility, and a deadlock there has to be some capacity to resolve a deadlock. And so therefore there has to be someone on the top of the system, and that person is the Governor-General.
We might come back to that a bit later, but just back to what actually happened then after word got out about the dismissal, and hundreds of people gathered on the front steps. Angry. And you went out and spoke to them. Can you remember what you said? And
I can't actually remember. I can't remember, but I would see the strangest thing happened. There was, I think, a brief cabinet meeting, but all the older ministers went home. That's Fred Daly, Frank Crane, Frank Stewart, Cameron. You wouldn't have thought this likely, would you? You know, that the government's been dismissed. Instead of staying in Parliament House, they pick up their bags and shuffle off. So I stay there. The interesting thing is, of course, then I warm up the crowd for Gough. Yes. But I'm the last minister elected, you understand?
At the tender age of 31? At
31, I'm the last minister. The interesting thing is both of us were Prime Minister. That's the interesting thing that comes out of that day. So I'm going, then Gough, of course, makes the big indignant, aggressive speech, which he, of course, was completely entitled to make, you know.
Were you taken aback by the intensity of that speech?
Yeah, because I had, there's that film footage of me handing him the, what would you call it?
The megaphone.
The megaphone, yeah, the megaphone. And then me standing behind him while the speech was going on. No, I wasn't surprised. It was the completely reasonable indignation of the fact, not necessarily that the Governor-General did insist upon a remedy, but just that he never took his Prime Minister into confidence in telling him of his constitutional doubts. And of course, as we now know, having been advised by the Chief Justice Barwick and Justice Mason and other people, that he was getting independent advice, not from just the Prime Minister and the government.
Which was inappropriate?
Completely inappropriate, yes.
Yes. And then what happened? The crowd was angry but not violent? No.
It was in every respect a coup. It was a coup by an individual, not a sort of violent gathering, but a coup. And everyone understood, I think, that something wrong had happened. You know, an elected government, properly elected, at a full vote, had been dismissed. You know, and they thought, in other words, the ground is shifting. What do you do? You know, everyone felt, gee, where are we now? You know, where's gravity? You know.
And then after you and Goff had spoken, you went round to see Goff.
I saw him, yes, he had people in and out. I had to sort of shuffle my way in, and he said to me, what do you want? What do you want? I said, look, let's think about this. I said to him, do you want me? I said, Kerr has expropriated the kingly powers of the monarch. That's what's happened here, or the queenly powers of the monarch. He may have done it with the monarch's knowledge, but he may not have done it. I think you're entitled to say to the Queen that you recommend the appointment of a different and new Governor-General, and your authority for offering the advice is the fact that the House of Representatives has voted no confidence in the appointed Prime Minister. In other words, you know, you would offer this advice to her and you would give her time to make that choice. Now, she was advised, the Queen was advised by clever people at the time, a very pushy guy, whose name I've forgotten now, who was, as we know by the letters, was in touch with Kerr. So while this problem was not of the Queen's making, it was of the Queen's need to resolve it. So my proposition was that Goff should ask the Queen to accept his advice about the appointment of a new Governor-General. And in the event that Kerr resisted, I said to Goff I thought he should be put under police arrest. You know? And Goff said, oh, God, you know. And I said,
found this a bit shocking?
A bit shocking, yeah. I said, the only thing you'd have to be sure about, Goff, is, of course, Kerr is technically the Commander-in-Chief, that the soldiers, that is the Chief of the Defence Force, do not end up in a fight with the police. In other words, you'd have to have the soldiers with you for this to happen. But then what would happen is you would then make a recommendation. The Queen could accept your recommendation. But I said, I think in all of that, you then have to go to a general election. That's what I thought. He said, thank you, you know all, for that advice. Thank you for your know all that advice. But you see, he wasn't of a mind to take the advice. He was a constitutionalist, Goff, you know. He wasn't into blood and gore, you know. He was a constitutionalist.
You think there would have been blood and gore?
Depends whether the army would have stuck with Kerr against the police. That's in my model. I mean, that's what I certainly would have done if I'd have been Prime Minister. Yeah. He said, "There's something about all you bastards from Sussex Street. You always want to lock someone up." He said, you know.
Even if it might have been appropriate.
Yeah. So, you know, the whole point of it was that after 23 years of a Conservative government, the Liberal National Party couldn't stand 18 months to 24 months of a Labor government, and the whole Fraser strategy was about pushing the unpopular Whitlam government to an election, which I think Malcolm Fraser would have won anyway later, you know, maybe a year later.
Because it was a very turbulent time, wasn't it? I mean, the blocking of supply did not come from nowhere. There was a lot of chaos.
Yeah. Well, you had Reg Withers, the senator, who was really the master of, let's call him the monster of ceremonies rather than the master of ceremonies in the Senate. And he and Fraser. There was a brutality about Malcolm. I mean, and of course, what it did, it delegitimised Malcolm's prime ministership. You know, he never survived it, really. It's the fact of it. but we still haven't resolved that impasse still exists. You see, you can still have in our current arrangements, the Senate can still refuse supply. So the constitutional arrangements in Canberra are perpetually unstable, potentially unstable.
But do you think, even though that power still exists, that it would still need characters like Gough Whitlam, like Malcolm Fraser, and like Sir John Kerr to make it happen?
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment, yeah. Whether that would be repeated today, I don't know. But I think that so unwise of the coalition to not let a Labor government have its 3 years. They pushed them to 2 elections. Remember, 74? Whitlam was elected in 72, December. 74, he's pushed by Billy Snedden as leader, threatening supply. So he has an election in 74, and then an election in 1975. The unreasonableness of it, But, Nicky, all the goodwill went out of the system after that. Before that, I was there for 2 opening of Parliament balls, so 1969 and 1972, and there was a generosity between the parties. I remember my backbench colleagues in the opposition joining me at the Currajong Hotel later. I brought my mother down for the opening of Parliament ball, and this was true in 69 and 72. But after dismissal, all that goodwill evaporated, never to return. It's never returned.
So you think it's had a lasting impact on relations between the 2 sides? I mean, in the old building, there were so many friendships across the yard, weren't there?
Yeah.
And I don't know whether the new place has had some effect on
Yeah.
limiting that.
No, well, of course, the old building was, everyone lived so close to one another. It was a small building and everybody knew everyone else, and but there was a certain, I'd say, if you look at the courtesies, say, between Chifley and well, you remember at the opening of Parliament Ball in 1949, Chifley died and Menzies suspended the ball, remember, which is a reasonable thing to have done. But I forget the point I was going to make to you, but there was always that kind of closeness and personal, because the thing is, it is the bush capital. It's not in the city. We don't live in the city, so people go there. They're locked up in the Boys and Girls Club. They live in 2 hotels or 3 hotels and apartments. It's got an artificial quality to it.
So, but you managed later to reach a kind of an accommodation with Malcolm Fraser.
Yeah.
You went to his funeral, and you had quite good relations with Tammy as well. So
I did, yeah.
Tell us how that came
about. Malcolm sought me out as treasurer. He said, look, you've got a serious mind. I can see by the changes, but I can't understand why you floated the exchange rate, and I can't understand your interest in opening, in wiping out tariffs. See, he was of his essence a protectionist. He was sort of a rural protectionist, Malcolm. And so we had a meeting and we talked about this, and another time, he used to be in a building that I shared in 101 Collins Street in Melbourne. Occasionally, I'd run into him. And so we talked about these sorts of things. Where we found more common cause later was his understanding of the risks that we're being placed under by the misinterpretation of the alliance with the United States. And he wrote that book, what's it called? What do you remember the name of the title? Dangerous Friends.
Eh? Dangerous Allies.
Dangerous Allies or Dangerous Friends. So he could see that we were being, particularly after Julia Gillard as Prime Minister and Stephen Smith as Foreign Minister, had let the Americans, with the Obama visit, bring 6,000 troops into Darwin. Malcolm would never have agreed to that. I would never have agreed to that. And that's now, of course, 7 B-52 nuclear-armed aircraft in Darwin. It's going to be 3 nuclear-armed submarines in Perth. And that's why he called them dangerous friends, you see. So we, and it's a very, I mean, it's a few years since I read the book, but it's a very powerful book, you know. And he was right about that. So he went up in my estimation. The other thing he did, he passed the Northern Territory Land Rights Act, introduced by Gough Whitlam, but where Gough never had the time to see its passage through the Senate. Malcolm carried that. And as you know, on ethnic issues, racial issues, he had a very good record. So Malcolm is a complex character who had a lot of goodness in him, but couldn't wait another year to see whether a normal election would give him the job.
Well, do you think he might have been pressured into it by the National Party and...
I think by Withers. Withers made a big impact. Yeah, Withers was a big influence on him, I think. But I'll just tell you, this is an interesting story. As the last minister in the government, you get the dirty jobs. And my job was to meet a German minister on the Tuesday morning at Sydney Airport. So I hang back to meet the minister and welcome him to Australia and get him into his car and what have you. And then I get on a plane with Bob Cotton, who was the most senior, and respected guy in the Senate, in the coalition. So he and I sit side by side in an Ansett plane, returning to Canberra at about 11. And I said, he said to me, I said, it's going to be a big day today, I think, Bob. He said, oh, our guy's nuts. Our guy's nuts. He said, this is all going to collapse.
Who did he mean, our guy?
Malcolm. Our guy's nuts. This is all going to collapse. He said, it's on the verge of collapsing. He said, by the end of the week, it'll be over. You see? That's what he says to me. This is Bob Cotton to me.
Did you believe that?
Oh, yeah, I did believe it, yes. Because Malcolm's sands were running out. See, I think he conveyed all this to Kerr, and Kerr acted to prevent the collapse. Yeah, because the Senate was doing something it was never designed to do, should never have been doing, you know, and the villainy of people over there, you know, with the Withers of this world. Wiser, more moderate heads in the Liberal and National Party were opposed to it. And it had gone on for weeks. Remember, this had gone on for weeks. And so Cotton said to me, this will be over, I'm telling you. So I thought, so when I arrived at my office, I thought, oh, this is all going to get resolved, you see. And of course, 2 hours later, we get dismissed.
But what was in it for Kerr?
I think Kerr, I don't quite know, but Gough used to call him, you know, that heavy intonation of Gough, my Governor-General. Well, Kerr would have hated being described as my Governor-General, right? A very impolitic thing to be doing. And the other thing is, either the Gorton or McMahon governments gave Kerr a job to look at the salaries of MPs. You know, before we had a system, we just had an occasional, every decade or so, there'd be some review of MP salaries. He gave us nothing. He didn't like us. So I don't know, I think he thought himself, I think Kerr decided that he was someone in history had passed over, but they'd only passed over it to this point, and we're not going to pass over it any further. In other words, he was going to be the man, you know. Anyway, I was witness to the fact that he completely deceived Whitlam, completely in my presence deceived him, you know. Yeah.
And just looking back now, I guess, from 50 years ago to today, what lasting impact do you think it's had on Parliament and our democracy?
Well, the House of Representatives is much more confrontationally robust, you know, if I get the right words, you know, a much more. Like, for instance, when I first went there, people like Wilfred Kent Hughes, who was a former First World War officer, Bill Wentworth. When they would speak at night, you'd go in, you'd speak on a bill, you'd go in and listen to them. No one would do that today. You know, I remember going to the House of Representatives one night, and Kim Beazley Senior, who's a wonderful speaker, made a speech about Aboriginal malnutrition amongst kids. And Wentworth got up and moved a motion of suspension for 20 minutes for the House to recompose itself.
Really?
Could you imagine that today? In other words, that was the, you know, and you could actually talk to journalists about getting a little column in the Mirror or the Sun about something you'd said. That's all gone. Now it's all sort of it's a big friction game that happens in the House of Representatives, and so you've got to keep the requirement after 1975 is to keep intellectual control of the House. Broadly, that's what was my job in the Hawke years. You know, though Bob was Prime Minister, all the sharp management of the politics was really left to me. You know, in and broad, not alone to me, but mostly to me, because if you kept, you know, if you had to keep the psychological control to win every week. Where before 1975, this was not true. You know, it just was not true. You know, like I remember John Howard saying to me one day, "You don't think there's a place for us in this Parliament, do they?" I said, "I do, John. It's under my shoe. It's under my shoe." You know, in other words, that was and I, you know, I met Peter Costello at a BHP end of year dinner drinks about 8 years ago, 10 maybe. It's the first time I'd ever spoken to him in my life. First time ever. You know, in other words, they did it in 75. We're not coming back. You know, you kept control. You kept the whip. You kept control.
So a very lasting impact and a very
it'll never be like it was. Believe me. And you had to be, there's only Doug McClellan and I left of it. Even when John Howard joined in 74, it was already, the Troubles were already on. So I'm probably the last one that experienced the old Parliament House, you know, the old executive thing, the relationship between the parties. But you'd go in and listen to what people had to say, you know, but no one would do that today.
Yes.
No.
I read Jim Killen's book recently, and he made a point of saying that. How everybody used to go into the Parliament and listen to people speak. Yeah,
and it was also fun, you know. I remember one, Clyde Cameron, there was this fellow, Winton Turnbull, his name was, he was a member for Mallee, and he'd be going on the adjournment speech about, and his electorate had been invaded by a noxious weed, you see. He tells the House the following week he gets up and he's got the weed. Cameron says, "Mr Speaker, point of order." "What could possibly be the point of order?" says the Speaker. And Cameron said, "Mr Speaker, which one is the weed?" Which, you know, there was all that kind of humour.
Funny but cruel.
Funny but cruel, yeah. There was this sort of, or Bert James throwing books across the chamber for Wilfred Burchett. Remember the communist reporter used to report communism in Vietnam? You know, he had all the books and he's throwing them. I mean, you wouldn't see that today.
Definitely not. Certainly was a livelier place
Yeah.
and a more robust place.
Yeah.
And we're very glad that you were able to speak to us about it today and relive some of those extraordinary events.
Well, thank you. Well, it's, of course, it was a cathartic moment for the country, from which we've really never recovered, and it won't recover while ever the Senate has the power or agrees and not to decline the right to refuse supply. In other words, the system is of its essence unstable, and so most of the time we live with this in relative harmony, but sometimes not.